In planning this afternoon, we decided to make it an open house because we didn't know what time people would want to come. We didn't want people to have to stay longer than their health would permit. So we decided that I would give the talk twice. So I'm going to deliver the same talk that I delivered earlier. So if you heard it the first time, you're welcome to stay, but don't be surprised. It might come out different anyway, probably will. Welcome to our open house. This open house was planned by the Board of Offer, the Organization for Fatigue and Fibromyalgia Education and Research, to provide an opportunity for people with chronic fatigue syndrome and fibromyalgia, for those of us who are insiders and our family and friends to come together so that we can understand what these illnesses, a little bit more about what these illnesses are, what the needs are, and where we need to go together to improve our situation in the future. And I want to tell you about the goal of Offer. Our organization is a nonprofit organization. This is not my business, not my office. Of course, I'm a doctor, I have a medical office, but I'm also on the board of this nonprofit. And our group, our goal is to try to extend the limited resources for people with fibromyalgia and chronic fatigue syndrome. And we've been particularly focused on education. We have a website, we have meetings. If you go to YouTube, I don't know if anybody likes to get on the internet, you go to the YouTube and put Offer Utah, one word, in the search, and you can find how many? 96 recorded educational programs on there with more to come, and it's a great resource. But this particular open house today is for us to talk about where we'd like to go in the future, particularly where the nonprofit would like to go. And I'm going to tell you our direction after I lay the groundwork with some other information. First question is, are ME, CFS, and fibromyalgia real and important? Now, ME is the term, the initials for myalgic encephalomyelitis. That is the term for chronic fatigue syndrome, especially severe symptoms of chronic fatigue syndrome used outside of the United States. And as we're making progress with these illnesses, we're trying to consolidate our terminology to bring all these groups under one large umbrella so we can study what processes cause widespread pain, brain fog, chronic fatigue, exercise intolerance, disturbed sleep, all the many symptoms that plague and are difficult for patients with these illnesses. But these illnesses are real and important. Fibromyalgia has two definitions that have been sanctioned by the American College of Rheumatology, published in the literature. Thousands and thousands of papers have been published establishing fibromyalgia as a condition of hyperalgesia and widespread pain that's very debilitating. Chronic fatigue syndrome has accepted case definitions published as early as 1988, the one we've been using more currently in 1994. And you may or may not realize this, but the government, the National Institutes of Health, has commissioned, issued a contract to a very important academic institution, a nonprofit called the Institute of Medicine, based in Washington, D.C., to gather experts to review the evidence and to recommend the direction we should go in terms of research, and to try to provide tools in terms of the case definition and the ways to diagnose patients to all the doctors and other medical providers in our country so that we can deliver care better. These illnesses are recognized and studied by every federal agency, including the Centers for Disease Control, and then there's a trans-NIH working group. It's a committee that has someone from each of the major institutions in the National Institute of Health to try to bring everyone together and start to problem solve on how we might be able to tackle and make progress in these illnesses. These illnesses, as we define them, are real, they are common, they are chronic, they can be disabling, they are very costly to the individuals who suffer, their families, and to our country. They are diagnosable, but not often diagnosed. They are treatable, but not often treated with skill in our current system. And people who have these illnesses are dramatically underserved by our medical system the way it exists currently. The main cause of extended school absence in adolescents is chronic fatigue syndrome or fibromyalgia. It's just rare for kids to have something that gets them out of school, and yet it's rarely, we have very few skills about how to help these kids. How common are these illnesses, the way we define them? Under the chronic fatigue syndrome case definition, the prevalence would be 0.5% of our population, that's 1 in 200 people, is afflicted by symptoms severe enough to meet the CFS criteria. And it's a little bit less, 0.1%, which would be about 1 out of 1,000 in children. But in children, that's a very high percentage for a chronic disabling illness. I went to a high school of 3,000. That would mean 3 of my classmates would be too sick to attend school and wouldn't get very good medical care and may not get the right diagnosis and treatment. The prevalence of fibromyalgia, the way we describe it with our current case definition, is, and this is a very conservative estimate, 2% in adults, which would be 2 out of 100 people meet the criteria. Higher in women than men, but it does exist in men and in children. And if you project those numbers, that would be 5 million people in the United States meet fibromyalgia criteria. I think it's actually much higher than that. That would be the more severe form of it. And 1 million people would meet the CFS most stringent criteria by the most conservative estimate. So if we translate that to Utah, that would be 15,000 adults in Utah would meet CFS criteria, and 60,000 adults would meet the fibromyalgia criteria. That is a stunning number. And I don't even know how many kids, because I'm not sure about the population numbers, but that's based on a total population of 3 million in Utah. We have a severe gap of services to the ill with these disorders, not just in Utah, but in the entire country. In fact, it's better in Utah than almost every other place in the country, partly because of the presence of very good clinicians in our community and the presence of Offer, this nonprofit, since 2001, an organization that have provided education to medical providers and education to the public to help everybody understand more about these illnesses and keep us up to date. And I don't want to pick on any particular institution, but I'm going to talk about the 2 major healthcare delivery institutions in our state. The first is the University of Utah, which is our major academic institution and a major referral hospital here in not just Utah, but the surrounding states. And I'm going to talk about Intermountain Healthcare. That's a huge healthcare delivery organization, owns hospitals, health plans, and is a very strong and high-quality force for healthcare in our state. Between these 2 huge organizations, there are very few resources for patients with fibromyalgia and chronic fatigue syndrome. I got online last night in preparation for this talk and tried to use the online provider search engine to try to find a provider or any kind of help as though I was a patient with either one of these illnesses. And at the University of Utah, the only thing that really came up were a random, I think they searched the database using the term chronic fatigue syndrome or fibromyalgia, and 3 providers came up, none of which were actually providers who are specialists in the area who would want to see patients that are physicians and that can bring patients in and treat them. At the Intermountain Healthcare, it was Intermountain Clinic. It was Intermountain Healthcare. It was not much different. Both of these organizations linked to large commercial databases that are available to outside of the system. Some of which the data was outdated and incorrect, not very specific, not very helpful. I took a quiz on how to identify fibromyalgia, and I only got 6 out of 9 questions right on the quiz. And I think that was not because I didn't understand fibromyalgia. To the credit of Intermountain Health, they have been a supporter of our education efforts. Last year, they supported our continuing education conference for medical providers as education, the CME provider, continuing medical education provider that sponsors it. And they will, although I'm not on a major provider on their health plans because I don't have full privileges at any of their hospitals, because it's not where I work. My office is not near any of their hospitals. They have allowed patients on Select Health and on their plans to ask for a special permission to come to our clinic, and they have allowed that for anybody who wants to come and be seen who can get into our clinic. And I've had an invitation to come and speak on these illnesses as in service to nurses and to some areas at IHC. So both places are friendly and getting a little bit more interested, but I'm very disappointed in those large major institutions' ability to provide good, general, accessible health care for patients with these illnesses. We have Alan and Kathy Light, who've done this stunning biomarker research. Alan and Kathy are here, raise your hands, yay. Gene expression studies and other studies with their team. Their work is recognized around the world for, I think, maybe the first good studies demonstrating that you can show with a blood draw that people are sick from these illnesses. Still in the research stage, but these studies have been heralded around the world, and they received a sizable grant from the NIH to continue these studies, and they'll be finishing up these studies in the next year or so, and hopefully we'll hear from them from these bigger studies. But I would say that Kathy and Alan are not appreciated in their environment. I would say that very few physicians in the University of Utah system are familiar with their research or very familiar with the current research in chronic fatigue syndrome and fibromyalgia. We're a little behind. So we have a long ways to go to get these, our illnesses recognized and to get the 75,000 people just in our state who need health care. Now, if and we have some good primary care physicians in our state who try to keep up on these illnesses. I know people have had less than positive experiences with some primary care physicians, but there are many good primary care physicians trying to keep up. But we don't have any specialists in the state who declare themselves as someone who is an expert in either one of these illnesses. And in our clinic, in my clinic, which is a small private practice, I've remained solo and private so that we can do the things we need to do and move forward without barriers. We have a low budget, very financially fragile, bare bones business plan to stay open. I have a wonderful and devoted staff that work in the clinic and in the research side with very low pay and no benefits. I can't even provide medical insurance for people who work in my clinic because of the level of financial, let's just say, tightness in our clinic. But even in my clinic, we can only see about 10 or 15% of people who call to be seen. We're just not big enough. There are not enough of us. And we've tried to, the patients we can get in, do a very good evaluation, follow, involve in research, and try to provide the most up-to-date and high-quality care. But we've only seen 1,500 patients in the 15 years that this clinic has been open, because we can't meet the huge need. We cannot be the only ones who see patients, who have expertise, and we are not trying to do that. I've realized over the years that the most important thing I can do as an experienced clinician, and my experience comes from all the patients who've come through my office, who've taught me about this illness, learning from them, trying to treat them, seeing what treatments work, what kind of illnesses occur, how people respond over time, what kinds of things help people get better, what kinds of things don't. That knowledge that I may have after all this time is going to retire with me if we don't find a way to train other clinicians in these illnesses. So I've decided that I need to spend a portion of my time not seeing patients, but communicating with other primary care doctors, teaching PAs, teaching nurse practitioners. Both of my PAs have been trying to lecture and teach and train people in their field. It takes time. We've been trying to advance knowledge at all levels and advocate on behalf of education. And I've tried to take time to network nationally. So I've been on the board of the CFS Association of America. I've been on the board of the CFS which is the Scientific Association of Scientists and Clinicians who are trying to advance this illness. I know most of the people in our country who are clinically seeing patients as specialists and who are trying to do research. I've been on the Chronic Fatigue Syndrome Advisory Committee that is a federal committee to advise the Secretary of Health at the Department of Health and Human Services. This committee is in existence and has been for, I'm sure, well over 15 years. and see what good it's doing. We're going to talk a little bit more about the recommendations of that committee. But I've had an opportunity to go to the FDA, to work on NIH committees, and now I'm on the Institute of Medicine committee that's reviewing the literature and trying to recommend where we should go in terms of providing a clinical case definition moving forward. But you can see that I'm spread pretty thin. We cannot see the patients in Utah in my little clinic who need to be seen. I'm just laying the groundwork for what I want to tell you OFFER needs to do, so be paying attention. So OFFER has taken the role mostly of education, our nonprofit. We've leveraged very low resources to reach many, many people using social networking, using the web, recording our lectures. We have all those lectures posted on the website and on the YouTube site. So how in the world did we get to this place? How could we be in 2014 with an illness well-defined that affects so many people and not have this illness mainstreamed and not have tests and not be able to understand how to take care of this illness? Well, this is my hypothesis. The first is we have a system that unintentionally has marginalized these illnesses. It's a system that's become more focused on saving money because of expense. It's a system that places low priority on illnesses that aren't fatal. So chronic illnesses have been kind of the last to be addressed if they don't kill people. Because of the economic issues, our clinicians are very rushed. They don't take time to talk to people anymore. Specialists are rushed. Care gets fragmented. Sometimes a specialist will do a test and not even talk to the patient about the test. Lots of times I do the explanation of the colonoscopy or the test, or the patient gets the explanation while they're still coming out of sedation and can't remember the discussion when they're done. So, and our technology right now, we love our technology, x-rays, labs, MRIs, EEGs, EKGs, but guess what? None of those things have demonstrated the problems of these illnesses very well. And yet we've come to worship our technology. And how many times have you had all those tests and had someone say, your tests are normal, you must not be sick? Well, that's just not very scientific, unfortunately. But doctors have stopped being scientists, and we've been pressured by finances and time. And these illnesses also don't fit into a specialty. I'm a generalist. I'm a primary care doctor. I can recognize multi-system illness. But when you go to a gastroenterologist, they just look at a piece, and a cardiologist. And they are, unfortunately, this is way more than primary care. These are illnesses that require advanced thinking and science and treatment. It's a little bit much for primary care. It's a lot for me. I can do it because I've been doing it for so long and we set up a system. But we don't have a specialty. Where did we fit? And everything's by specialty now. And our illness doesn't fit. It comes the closest for fibromyalgia, which has come through rheumatology, but guess what? Fibromyalgia is not a rheumatologic illness. And rheumatologists are very divided about whether or not they should take care of fibro patients. Half of them hate it and don't want to do it because it's not what they do. And the other half are compassionate and trying to do it, but they're doing it with few tools, and they're trying to do it. And some of them that really do it get overwhelmed because there are so many patients with fibromyalgia, and they can't do regular rheumatology. So it's very, very much a problem. And the last problem is a little tricky, but we've moved towards what's called evidence-based medicine. And that means we have a very high standard of what we accept as true in medicine and what we will teach in medical school. And that high standard is by the quality of research. And research has to have many patients, it has to be double-blind, it has to, there are many features of research before it will be considered useful. Well, guess what? If we only teach things that have already been proven, it's very difficult to make progress with an illness we don't understand. And this illness, we don't have a big evidence base. It's been stereotyped and pushed out into the margin because of all these issues. And we've gone all this time, a decade, since I think a decade ago, we knew almost everything we know today about these illnesses. Have made very little progress, with the exception of things I'm going to talk about in a few minutes. Well, what about these illnesses? What is it about these illnesses that could have missed scrutiny? Well, it's probably the areas of medicine we're weak in. The area of viruses, we can't culture viruses, we don't have very many drugs for viruses, we don't understand them, they're hard to see, they're expensive to study. We don't know too much about the immune system, particularly autoimmune diseases. There are many, many autoimmune diseases, Every organ in the body has an associated autoimmune disease, but the area we understand the least is the nervous system and the autonomic nervous system and the brain in terms of what might be equivalent to an autonomic or an autoimmune problem. And there are probably many autoimmune diseases we don't understand yet. Why should we think we know every one? And if we don't have a test for it, that doesn't mean it doesn't exist. We don't understand endocrine very well, particularly the central component, the major command of your hormone organs. We don't understand the brain. It's difficult to image. You can't biopsy it. It's hard to study it. It's hard to treat it because, well, you know, you like your brain. You don't really want people sticking needles in there and doing things to your brain. We have very rudimentary understanding of genetics, epigenetics, gene expression. We're starting to get better technology, but these are the areas of medicine that are on the forefront. This is probably the area of medicine where we're going to learn about these illnesses. That would be a perfect explanation about why we've missed it all this time. So in the last 5 years, we've made very good progress, particularly in fibromyalgia. The approval of drugs and the dollars from pharma have driven great education, especially with primary care and in the public. Fibromyalgia is a household word. Everybody understands that it's an illness now. I have to say we're making progress, but people still don't know how to treat it very well. We've had a lot of experience in our clinic. It's a very treatable, complex illness, but it's not one drug, of course, right? You can't just prescribe a drug and take care of this illness. So we're making progress. But we do the best with mild illness. The more severe the fibromyalgia, the more you're likely to meet the CFS criteria, which is debilitation, fatigue, inability to function, and relapse when you try to function. Don't think of these illnesses as two separate things, right? One's a description of the degree of pain, one's a description of the degree of dysfunction and fatigue, and they're not mutually exclusive. And people who meet criteria for both are the most sick and the most disabled. And we don't even think there's one illness. There's multiple illnesses that end up with these manifestations. The good news about ME/CFS is that we've made a huge amount of progress at federal institutions. Our federal government has changed in the last 5 years. They have adopted us, and they are trying to make progress. They finally started listening to the advisory committee. They had a State of the Knowledge conference in 2009 where they brought researchers together and examined what we knew and what we don't know and where we should go. Social Security just issued a new ruling this year about giving doctors better information about how to identify patients who might be disabled by the illness. The Centers for Disease Control is doing a study I'm going to tell you about across the country, and the NIH, as I said before, is sponsoring a huge review of the literature, which most people aren't even familiar with. There are 5,000 articles published about chronic fatigue syndrome. And most physicians, there are still physicians who think it's not a real illness. They don't understand what we're dealing with these illnesses. So I want to go back to the recommendations by the CFS Advisory Committee. They call it CFSAC. Federal people are funny. They speak their acronyms. I can't call it CFSAC for some reason. Anyway, back in 2004, one of the recommendations to the Secretary of Health from our committee was to establish 5 centers of excellence. We thought that the most important thing would be in the United States to have centers funded by the government that would allow people to come, be evaluated, have experts do research, and provide a place where we could make progress and then send information out to physicians. There's the exact wording from the September 2004. And in that, we recommended that the funding be in the range of $1.5 million per center per year for 5 years. That was the request from our committee. Well, we requested the exact same thing again the next year. We didn't even change the words. Put the very same recommendation in there. In 2006, we didn't. We had some other recommendations. In 2007, we wrote an epistle about the Centers for Excellence. I read this in the last talk, maybe I won't go through it, but essentially detailing for the Secretary of Health the prevalence, the degree of debilitation patients with this illness have, and this is all from the literature and good scientific studies, that this translates to huge costs, $25 billion annually in our country lost in lost productivity and medical costs if you add it up. And that is cost to families. That is cost to us. Those of you who have someone ill in your family understand how those costs multiply in terms of the loss of what people can bring in and the money that goes out the door trying to get medical help. And these factors in combination mandate the creation of innovative measures to focus resources on identifying solutions to these critical problems. And it goes on, it really was an epistle. And we said that this is really due to a complete lack of clinical care centers and research centers. There really aren't centers that are studying these illnesses, taking the patients in, studying them, organizing them. So again, we requested that the Health and Human Services establish 5 regional clinical care research and education centers and fund them. That didn't happen. And in 2009, guess what? Our committee asked again to establish regional centers at the 2 meetings in 2009. In 2010, we took a different tack. And this was, well, if they're not going to create centers of excellence funded by the government, perhaps the government could fund networking between existing clinics. So we said develop a national research and clinical network for using regional hubs to link multidisciplinary resources in expert patient care, disability assessment, educational initiative, research and clinical trials. This could be a resource for experts in healthcare policy. Well, none of that happened, and we don't have centers for excellence. But I want to leave that thought in your mind as I talk a little bit more about how the research has changed. And I think this really started in 2009 when we thought a retrovirus called XMRV might cause chronic fatigue syndrome. I don't know if any of you remember hearing this. Well, there was an explosion of interest that generated participation, finally. They thought it was a fatal disease. See, they paid attention. They thought it was a retrovirus. That's what it's related to HIV, the virus that causes AIDS. That is the family of what retroviruses is, and that caught everybody's attention, that this could possibly be a retrovirus. So patients volunteered, clinicians, scientists, the federal bodies, the blood bank safety committee, nonprofits, pharmaceuticals, academic institutions, for-profit institutions. There was a huge effort to try to understand and capitalize and leverage this idea that XMRV might cause chronic fatigue syndrome. Unfortunately, it proved not to be true, or fortunately, depending on how you look at it. Not all science leads to the correct answer, but it really made awareness of this illness move forward centuries, decades. And what was fun was our clinic was an important part of that, our community. One day after hearing the first study about XMRV, I Googled it, and one of the researchers in XMRV was at the University of Utah. I called Dr. Ela Singh. I said, I can provide patients for you. She designed a study, and 2 weeks after we started the study, 100 patients responded to our request to come in and had been identified and gone up and had their blood drawn within a 2-week period. So that's an example of how a clinic that has a large number of patients can rapidly mobilize patients when there's an important research question to be asked. So we were able to, and the Lights helped with this, and Dr. Singh's lab and others, ARUP lab, do a really excellent study that took a long time because as the study progressed, we realized that XMRV was probably not the pathogen and that we could provide good evidence in a negative study and put our information out in the literature. And then our site was also one of the sites, the NIH spent $1 million having an officially sanctioned study to show that XMRV was not the pathogen causing chronic fatigue syndrome. But that really got things going. The NIH had the State of the Knowledge workshop. The FDA, to their credit, in the last 2 years, has sponsored really good voice of the patient workshops. One in chronic fatigue syndrome last year. The report date is available online if you want to find it. Just put voice of the patient, FDA, CFS, and then they just barely held the fibromyalgia meeting, calling patients in, asking them, getting their testimony, what symptoms do you have, what treatments do you need, what has your experience been, what do we need to do to foster drug development to help you with this horrible illness. And that has been an important step in progress. The Centers for Disease Control has gone outside. Instead of doing their own internal research under new direction in Beth Unger, they've gone to chronic fatigue clinics and established a big study where they are recruiting information from 500 patients in the country. Our clinic is one of them. Dr. Nadelson in New York, Dr. Klimas in Florida, and we're part of a group that's using an electronic health record with the Institute of Medicine. This group right here under Annie Kogelnick's electronic health record. And among us, and some of you may be part of this, but our patients are volunteering, giving information, teaching the Centers for Disease Control about this illness, so that we can move it forward. And the papers from the Centers for Disease Control study are just starting to come out. They haven't been published, but they have presented the information at several conferences. This is just a map showing our clinics in the US where we are, and a couple of the graphs. Because when they have a study this big, guess what? This starts to meet the standard of evidence-based medicine. And it comes from the Centers for Disease Control. So as these papers are published, we'll be able to validate just how ill people are with chronic fatigue syndrome, what their major symptoms are, and how difficult it is for them to function. So for years, we've been stuck in this bubble. No biomarkers, not sure what to call this illness complex. And all these important links to moving science forward have been outside. Academic institutions, scientists, pharmaceutical companies, the federal agencies, you can see in our medical providers. And the CDC was kind of stuck inside, and those poor people in the early CDC unit were not respected, I don't think, for researching this illness. But things have changed. And we now have pharmaceutical companies, we have guidance from the FDA inviting them to submit studies to help treat these illnesses, and we still have some work to go. But these changes have raised credibility. Drug development, scientific publications, these federal bodies, really positive media. You guys all see somebody stole my front page. So the Deseret News today had a great story about 2 of our patients with chronic fatigue syndrome, and about Alan Cathy's research looking for a biomarker so that we can diagnose these illnesses and start to look at gene expression to know how there might be subsets of illness, what the mechanisms might be, and how we might be able to go forward in treating it. So we've been part of creative utilization of existing resources. My clinic, Offer, almost everybody in the field, very little funding. Same with Alan Cathy. Before this big NIH grant that they have right now, they got money from Offer and personal donations. They used their own money. They used money they could scrape up to do some of this research and move it forward. Now we have federal funds going into education and organization, but not into centers of excellence yet. So, and every one of these big processes identified this huge area of need. That area of need is we don't have a place for patients to go and be taken care of. Can't access doctors. You can't get a good diagnosis, and that your doctor says, I think you have fibromyalgia, but I'm not sure what to do about it, or there's no treatment. And they're not up to date on all the science that is building. Most of what's happened has been through private funds. And I want to talk to you about a couple of studies. There is a nonprofit based in New York called the Chronic Fatigue Initiative. This was funded by the Hutchins Family Foundation. They formed it. They said, we're going to put $10 million in this foundation, and we want you to hire a very good CEO. You go solve this illness. And there's a family member that is ill with chronic fatigue syndrome. That's why people get interested most of the time. Well, to their credit, it's been a hard road, but they have done a multi-site study. Our site was one of those studies. You can see the 5 sites there: Miami, Utah, Nevada, New York, and Boston. Plus investigators, amazing investigators, very high-profile epidemiologists from Columbia University, analyzing the samples and trying to understand. The samples have been banked at Duke in a biobank, and 200 patients have had every orifice sampled, and their history, and they've been tracked. So the preliminary data from this study is coming out. The first paper is, I can tell you, just been submitted for publication. So we don't have it yet, but more to follow. And I think this project will result in numerous papers. It'll have a a large number of patients, controls. This is going to reach the level of good evidence base. It's going to reach the literature. And I have to brag about one small study we did that was a part of that, but CFI funded it. 4 of the investigators thought, well, we've got this money from this group, we better do as much as we can while they're interested in chronic fatigue syndrome. So we put together a study where we called 250 patients that we had seen years ago. So we dug down into our records and tried to go back 10 years, reach patients. Between the 4 clinics, we called almost 1,000 patients and interviewed them on the phone about the state of their illness, the things they developed, what things worked, what things didn't, and we're going to be able to pull that together. And we presented the first data from that study at the conference in San Francisco in March, and that is also, one of the papers from that study is on its way and should be submitted for publication in the next maybe month or so. At least the one on treatments, and there will be one on comorbidities and one describing this big patient population. It will be the biggest study ever published looking at, it's not a very high-tech study, but it has a lot of weaknesses because we just talk to people on the phone, and but it's going to be the biggest study with a look at what happens over time to people with this illness. And I'll tell you that 90 to 94% of the people we called on the phone, still had chronic fatigue syndrome. And they were still impaired. Some people had improved, but were still impaired by their illness. So things are improving. We still need help we still need to convert academic institutions that will follow the published papers. But there's that big area of care providers that the trickle down from academic institutions isn't reaching them. They're not getting taught. The evidence base isn't there. When you try to get in and see them, we don't have experts. All those reasons we talked about. There are centers of excellence popping up, and I want to talk about a few of them. Dr. Klimas, who's been in the field a long time in immunology, had a private donor who felt it imperative that this go forward, and she left University of Miami and went to another university, and they're starting a very big multidisciplinary, well, not multidisciplinary, but yeah, sort of a really good center of excellence there where they'll see patients and do research, and I'm really excited to see how that materializes. Dan Peterson, who actually went to school here in Utah, medical school, and was one of the first people to identify the outbreak in Lake Tahoe. If you know the history of chronic fatigue syndrome, he was the physician there, is pairing with a nonprofit called Cimarron Research. I told you about the OMI in California that's trying to use electronics to join clinics together and create sort of a virtual center of excellence. The Whittemore Peterson Institute in Reno, trying to recover from, as you can imagine, was a devastating fallout from XMRV. They're the site that published the first XMRV paper, but they still have a great center, researchers, and they have a clinician, they're going to try to see patients. But it's predominantly foundation based as well. There's a physician, Dr. Enlander, Mount Sinai, that's where Ilasing is now, and there's been a large private donation given to that center, and they're building a center of excellence. And Dr. Montoya at Stanford, I think, is doing some of the most exciting things right now. He's an infectious disease specialist, and he has been devoted to his patients. And he is digging deep to find people with an investment in this illness who can come forward and bring their research and move the field forward. And then, of course, we've got Dr. Ian Lipkin and Mady Hornig at Columbia, who are now hooked, right? They got involved because of the CFI project. We haven't been able to find a pathogen, but guess what? They know this is a devastating illness, and it's just driving him crazy. He can't figure this illness out, and he is not going to stop until he can figure it out. I like that. The problem is there's still no place for patients to go. The Stanford Clinic has a 4-year waiting list for patients to be seen. Nancy Klimas' clinic are trying to get people in, but they're all busy. Nancy's doing what I'm doing, and they're trying to hire more physicians in Miami. My clinic, and there's a reputation at my clinic, well-deserved, that people can't get in. Even with that, of the people who contact our clinic to come in, we can only see about 10%. That is our capacity. So 90% of the people who need to get in, who get through and want to come into my clinic, we can't see. We don't have enough. There's only a few of us. We only have so many hours in the day. So the huge need goes unmet, even in places where we have providers who have a lot of experience in these illnesses. We need specialty clinics for the workup of the illness and getting a diagnosis. We need clinics that offer treatment and care. We need academic positions for clinicians and researchers. We need research institutions. We need training sites for people who are going into the medical field. We need training sites for people who are going to do research. We need groups to apply for grants. We need biomarker studies, clinical drug trials. All of these things are desperately needed. And they will happen because the science is coming, and it's going to mow over us whether we like it or not. And as tests are developed and as the illnesses are defined, we're not going to have trained providers to bring patients in and be able to take care of them, particularly in the next small time. I wanted to read this. I'll just make it short. This was a letter, an email I received yesterday. Actually, I read it this morning from one of my patients who said her 16-year-old son seems to be having the symptoms that she's having, and she's not sure what to do. His heart rate goes up to 200 after exercise. He's an athlete. He can't exercise anymore. They took him to a cardiologist, and they did the standard tests and couldn't find anything wrong with his heart, even though he almost fainted, and they did the stress test. They sent him back to primary care, and they're back to ground zero. They don't know where to go, and she said, my son keeps saying, I don't feel right, something's wrong, I'm so tired. He's not the type to complain unless something's really bad. And she didn't want to bother me. She sent me an email, and she actually didn't mention it to me in her last clinic visit because she was really not sure it would be possible to bring him in. Well, I want to tell you that in February, a paper was published demonstrating antibodies in the blood in young people like that boy who have tachycardia. It's called postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome, or POTS. And the paper took adolescents who'd had a viral illness like mono and then seemed to be getting better, and then developed this horrible tachycardia, inability to exercise and stand up. This group published in the Journal of the American Heart Association, very prominent journal, and they were able to identify antibodies that bind to receptors that control your heart and cardiovascular system. Some of these receptors control your blood vessel constriction, and they block it so that your blood vessels will not constrict. So it's like they're lax. So when they stand up, their blood pressure drops down. They also identified antibodies that bind to the receptors that control your heart rate. And these antibodies, they're like autoimmune antibodies, bind to the beta receptors and make the heart go inappropriately fast. So while the heart rate is dropping, the blood pressure is dropping, the heart rate races sometimes up to 200. Do you know that when your heart is going 200, it doesn't have time to fill, right? Your heart has to beat slow enough that the chamber fills before it squeezes. If it beats so fast, it doesn't pump anything. That's a reason why you can't stand up when your heart races that fast, and you have to slow the heart down. So we have a study that might explain the autoimmune basis of some of our adolescents with chronic fatigue syndrome. We also have recent studies that show that people with widespread pain that we call fibromyalgia, some of them may actually have a small fiber peripheral neuropathy that has previously not been detectable. This paper was published in Pain, which is a major journal, in last November, by the lead researcher is a neurologist at Harvard, Ann Oaklender, and her team. We're going to have someone from her team come talk at our conference in September. They took patients with fibromyalgia, 27 patients, and 30 people who didn't have fibromyalgia. They put them through a regular medical exam and history, but they took a little biopsy of the skin on their leg. And 41% of those fibromyalgia patients had a small vessel polyneuropathy when it was examined under the microscope. This is damage to the small nerves in the skin, and only 3% of the control subjects. And you can't see it very well. This is on the left is a normal picture, and on the right is abnormal. You can see these tiny little hair-like filaments with the arrows are plentiful in the normal biopsy and are absent in the person that has had these little small nerves damaged, probably by an autoimmune process or a virus or some kind of toxic exposure. What was even more stunning was the paper I pulled up of the study they did in adolescents. So they took 41 adolescents who met criteria for fibromyalgia and did the same thing. Only 1 out of 41 did not have an abnormal biopsy. Only 1 was normal. So all of the kids they picked for the subject had small fiber polyneuropathy when they did the biopsy. And when they did a careful exam, they had findings, and they did exhaustive labs. They were able to find evidence of autoimmune illness or disordered immunity in almost all of them. And you can see they had dysautonomia, that's like blood pressure and pulse problems, chronic fatigue, headaches, and all the problems we see in patients with chronic fatigue and fibromyalgia. And how many fibromyalgia in the patients, think of you fibromyalgia patients in the room, how many of these symptoms look familiar to you? Cold-like pain, tingling, pins and needles, burning, shock-like pains that worsen when you're resting or at night, dry eyes, dry mouth, postural lightheadedness, that's being dizzy when you stand up, fainting, temperature intolerance, GI symptoms, bladder symptoms. So a small fiber polyneuropathy can create a lot of symptoms. This is a picture from one of my patients I thought I'd put up there that I'm pretty sure has this kind of neuropathy. And what's stunning is it's a normal neuro exam, normal EMGs, normal nerve conduction. So all the things that neurologists do would not pick this up. So any fibromyalgia patient that had this would be told by the neurologist previously that it was all, well, that it wasn't a neurologic problem, right? And that they, I don't know what they would think about their complaints of pain and all those many symptoms in their whole body. So it's studies like this that are going to change everything right away. And these are just a couple of representative studies. Doctors Light and other researchers at the U would like to team up with me and our patients and maybe replicate these studies and see if we can quickly show that these small studies really do occur and these findings occur in our patients. But we don't have much time. We're overwhelmed and spread thin. We don't have funding, we don't have resources, and those things take time. The last study I wanted to mention was published just recently. It was presented at the recent ICF SME conference in San Francisco, and I thought about it after I got here, so I don't have a slide, but some data were presented from some great, really long-term chronic fatigue researchers in Japan. And they have developed a technique that they can label glial cells, which are a type of cell in your brain that we think is involved in innate immunity, protecting your neurons and your brain cells and all the other nerve cells that do the nerve duties. They were able to give someone an IV and put something in their blood that would go up and stick to those glial cells so that when they get in a PET scan, you can tell when glial cells are activated. Now, activated glial cells are abnormal. They're causing inflammation to nearby nerve cells. And I have no idea what to do about that. They did a study, a small one, with 10 chronic fatigue syndrome patients and control patients, and they were able to demonstrate inflammation in the brainstem and in areas of the brain in people with chronic fatigue syndrome, showing that there was neuroinflammation in the brain, which would explain a lot about some of the bizarre neurologic symptoms that a lot of people with chronic fatigue syndrome present with. If you want to hear a summary of it, you can go to my YouTube talk. If you go to YouTube and go to Offer Utah, and I gave this talk at the Offer Education meeting. If you just put PET scans and CFS in Google, you'll probably find this published study because it's really big and important news. Just yesterday, there was an article in Scientific American about this project at the Institute of Medicine to review the literature and make recommendations about chronic fatigue syndrome. And then just today in the paper, a great article about the research going on up at the U and interviews with 2 of our wonderful patients who were willing to have their pictures taken and spend time talking to the people there. So we are on the brink of an explosion of scientific progress. I believe we have so many answers hovering out there, but we really need to make a huge shift in what we're doing and I'm talking about Offer and all of us. The board of Offer has decided it's not enough for us to post web notices and have educational meetings. And we've decided that what Offer needs to do is take a big jump and build a center of excellence. Now this is huge. We need to raise at least $1 million or $2 million just to get started, because we have to hire people who know how to build a real clinic, not one that's run, on fumes. And we have to attract good researchers, good clinicians. We have to take what we have and grow it so that we have a center of excellence that rivals any of those other centers of excellence in the country. If we can raise that money and build this center of excellence, I believe that we will be self-sustaining, because I think for the next decade, we're going to be doing research. We're going to be validating these studies. We're going to do treatment trials, but only if we can build a clinic that sees every patient that calls, not a clinic that sees 10% of the people who call, of the ones who still think they can get in. So we need to increase our capacity. We need to have a clinic that can take care of everybody and do the research. So everybody needs to find their niche. I want everybody to contribute. We can't be turtles any longer in terms of this. We can be turtles in the way we manage our illness. That's sort of our motto, right? Slow and steady wins the race. But I wore my bear belt buckle. You can see we need to be bears now. We need to jump forward. We need to those of us who are well especially need to take command. We need to raise this money. We need to build this center of excellence and move forward. So OFFER is going to establish and implement a regional center of excellence if we can get the money. And we're going to follow the model recommended to the Secretary of Health by the CFS Advisory Committee. We're going to try to raise the money, and we're going to use what local resources we have as the starting point, if we can, to build this clinic. And we're hopefully going to call it the Shauna Bateman Horn Center of Excellence. That's my sister, and you guys may not know the story of my sister. I can't remember if Scott told it at the beginning. My sister passed away, but my sister had chronic fatigue syndrome, and she is the reason that I'm obsessed with this illness, because I decided I was not going to rest until I could figure it out. Anyway, thank you for your attention. Please find a way to get involved, help with OFFER, network, see if you can find money, see if you can find people to work for OFFER, see if you can find people who want to come work in our clinic, and let's go. Thank you.